The Great Purge of the Great Terror was a campaign of political repression in the Soviet Union which occurred from 1936 to 1938. It involved a large-scale purge of the Communist Party and government officials, repression of peasants and the Red Army leadership, and widespread police surveillance, suspicion of saboteurs, imprisonment, and arbitrary executions. In Russian historiography, the period of the most intense purge, 1937–1938, is called Yezhovshchina, after Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the Soviet secret police, NKVD. It has been estimated between 600,000 and 1.2 million people were murdered by the Soviet government. In the Western world, Robert Conquest's 1968 book, The Great Terror, popularized that phrase. Conquest's title was in turn in allusion to the period called the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. Introduction. The term repression was officially used to describe the prosecution of people considered counter-revolutionaries and enemies of the people by the leadership of the Soviet Union. The purge was motivated by the desire to remove dissenters from the Communist Party and to consolidate the authority of Joseph Stalin. Most public attention was focused on the purge of the leadership of the Communist Party, as well as of government bureaucrats and leaders of the armed forces, most of whom were party members. The campaigns also affected many other categories of the society: intelligentsia, peasants, and especially those branded as too rich for a peasant, and professionals. A series of NKVD operations affected a number of national minorities accused of being fifth-column communities. A number of purges were officially explained as an elimination of the possibilities of sabotage and espionage, mostly by a fictitious Polish military organization, and, consequently, many victims of the purge were ordinary Soviet citizens of Polish origin. According to Nikita Khrushchev's 1956 speech on the personality cult and its consequences, and more recent findings, a great number of accusations, notably those presented at the Moscow show trials, were based on false confessions, often obtained through torture, and on loose interpretations of Article 58 of the RSFSR Penal Code, which dealt with counter-revolutionary crimes. Due legal process, as defined by Soviet law in force at the time, was often largely replaced with summary proceedings by NKVD troikas. Hundreds of thousands of victims were accused of various political crimes. They were quickly executed by shooting, or sent to the Gulag labor camps. Many died at the penal labor camps of starvation, disease, exposure, and overwork. Other methods of dispatching victims were used on an experimental basis. One secret policeman, for example, gassed people to death in batches in the back of a specially adapted airtight van. The Great Purge was started under the NKVD chief General Yagoda, but the height of the campaigns occurred while the NKVD was headed by Nikolai Yezhov, from September 1936 to August 1938. Hence the name Yezhovshchina. The campaigns were carried out according to the general line, and often by direct orders, of the party Politburo headed by Stalin. Background. From 1930 onwards, the party and police officials feared the social disorder caused by the upheavals of forced collectivization of peasants and the resulting famine of 1932–1933, as well as the massive and uncontrolled migration of millions of peasants into cities. The threat of war heightened Stalin's perception of marginal and politically suspect populations as the potential source of an uprising in case of invasion. he began to plan for the preventive elimination of such potential recruits for a mythical fifth column of wreckers, terrorists and spies. The term purge in Soviet political slang was an abbreviation of the expression purge of the party ranks. In 1933, for example, the party expelled some 400,000 people, but from 1936 until 1953, the term changed its meaning, because being expelled from the party came to mean almost certain arrest, imprisonment, and often execution. The political purge was primarily an effort by Stalin to eliminate challenge from past and potential opposition groups, including the left and right wings led by Leon Trotsky and Nikolai Bukharin, respectively. Following the Civil War and reconstruction of the Soviet economy in the late 1920s, veteran Bolsheviks no longer thought necessarily the temporary wartime dictatorship, which had passed from Lenin to Stalin. Stalin's opponents on both sides of the political spectrum chided him as undemocratic and lax on bureaucratic corruption. These tendencies may have accumulated substantial support among the working class by attacking the privileges and luxuries the state offered to its high-paid elite. The Yeltsin affair seemed to vindicate Stalin's suspicions. He enforced a ban on party factions and banned those party members who had opposed him, effectively ending democratic centralism. In the new form of party organization, the Politburo, and Stalin in particular, were the sole dispensers of ideology. This required the elimination of all Marxists with different views, especially those among the prestigious old guard of revolutionaries. As the purges began, the government shot Bolshevik heroes, including Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Byakut Kun, as well as the majority of Lenin's Politburo, for disagreements in policy. The NKVD attacked the supporters, friends, and family of these heretical Marxists, whether they lived in Russia or not. The NKVD nearly annihilated Trotsky's family before killing him in Mexico. The NKVD agent Ramon Mercader was part of an assassination task force put together by Special Agent Pavel Sudopletov under the personal orders of Stalin. In 1934, Stalin used the murder of Sergei Kirov as a pretext to launch the Great Purge, in which about 1 million people perished. Some later historians came to believe that Stalin arranged the murder, or at least that there was sufficient evidence to reach such a conclusion. Kirov was a staunch Stalin loyalist, but Stalin may have viewed him as a potential rival because of his emerging popularity among the moderates. The 1934 Party Congress elected Kirov to the Central Committee with only 3 votes against, the fewest of any candidate, while Stalin received 292 votes against. After Kirov's assassination, the NKVD charged the former oppositionists, an ever-growing group according to the determination, with Kirov's murder as well as a growing list of other offenses, including treason, terrorism, sabotage, and espionage. Another justification for the purge was to remove any possible fifth column in case of a war. Vyacheslav Molotov and Lazar Kaganovich, participants in the repression as members of the Politburo, maintained this justification throughout the purge. They each signed many death lists. Stalin believed war was imminent, threatened both by an explicitly hostile Germany and an expansionist Japan. The Soviet press portrayed the country as threatened from within by fascist spies. For the October Revolution onward, Lenin had used repression against perceived enemies of the Bolsheviks as a systematic method of instilling fear and facilitating social control, especially during the campaign commonly referred to as the Red Terror. This policy continued and intensified under Stalin. Periods of heightened repression, including the deportation of kulaks who opposed collectivization, and a severe famine in the Ukraine. A distinctive feature of the Great Purge was that, for the first time, members of the ruling party were included on a massive scale as victims of the repression. Due to the scale of the terror, the substantial victims of the purges were Communist Party members and office holders. The purge of the party was accompanied by the purge of the whole society. The following events are used for the demarcation of the period. The First Moscow Trial, 1936. 1937 – Introduction of NKVD troikas for implementation of revolutionary justice. 1937 – Passage of Article 58-14 about counter-revolutionary sabotage. Moscow Trials. First and Second Moscow Trials between 1936 and 1938. Three very large Moscow trials of former senior Communist Party leaders were held, in which they were accused of conspiring with fascist and capitalist powers to assassinate Stalin and other Soviet leaders, dismember the Soviet Union and restore capitalism. These trials were highly publicized and extensively covered by the outside world, which was mesmerized by the spectacle of Lenin's closest associates confessing to most outrageous crimes and begging for death sentences. The first trial was of 16 members of the so-called Trotskyite Communist Zinovieite leftist counter-revolutionary bloc, held in August 1936, at which the chief defendants were Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, two of the most prominent former party leaders. Among other accusations, they were incriminated with the assassination of Sergei Kirov and plotting to kill Stalin. After confessing to the charges, all were sentenced to death and executed. The second trial in January 1937 involved 17 lesser figures known as the anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center, which included Karl Radek, Yuri Piatakov and Grigory Sokolnikov, and were accused of plotting with Trotsky, who was said to be conspiring with Germany. 13 of the defendants were eventually executed by shooting. The rest received sentences in labor camps where they soon died. There was also a secret trial before a military tribunal of a group of Red Army commanders, including Mikhail Tukhachevsky, in June 1937. Some Western observers who attended the trials said that they were fair and that the guilt of the accused had been established. They based this assessment on the confessions of the accused, which were freely given in open court, without any apparent evidence that they had been extracted by torture or drugging. The British lawyer and Member of Parliament D.N. Pritt, for example, wrote, "Once again the more faint-hearted socialists are beset with doubts and anxieties, but once again we can feel confident that when the smoke has rolled away from the battlefield of controversy it will be realized that the charge was true, the confessions correct and the prosecution fairly conducted." Others, like Fitzroy Maclean, were a little more astute in their observations and conclusions. It is now known that the confessions were given only after great psychological pressure and torture had been applied to the defendants. From the accounts of former OGPU officer Alexander Orlov and others, the methods used to extract the confessions are known. Such tortures as repeated beatings, simulated drownings, making prisoners stand or go without sleep for days on end, and threats to arrest and execute the prisoners' families. For example, Kamenev's teenage son was arrested and charged with terrorism. After months of such interrogation, the defendants were driven to despair and exhaustion. Zinoviev and Kamenev demanded, as a condition for confessing, a direct guarantee from the Politburo that the lives and that of the families and followers would be spared. This offer was accepted, but when they were taken to the alleged Politburo meeting, only Stalin, Clement Voroshilov, and Yezhov were present. Stalin claimed that they were the commission authorized by the Politburo and gave assurances that death sentences would not be carried out. After the trial, Stalin not only broke his promise to spare the defendants, he had most of the relatives arrested and shot. Dewey Commission. In May 1937, the Commission of Inquiry into the charges made against Leon Trotsky in the Moscow trials, commonly known as the Dewey Commission, was set up in the United States by supporters of Trotsky to establish the truth about the trials. The commission was headed by the noted American philosopher and educator John Dewey. Although the hearings were obviously conducted with a view to proving Trotsky's innocence, they brought to light evidence which established that some of the specific charges made at the trials could not be true. For example, Georgy Putakov testified that he had flown to Oslo in December 1935 to receive terrorist instructions from Trotsky. The Dewey Commission established that no such flight had taken place. Another defendant, Ivan Smirnov, confessed to taking part in the assassination of Sergei Kirov in December 1934, at a time when he had already been in prison for a year. The Dewey Commission later published its findings in a 422-page book titled Not Guilty. Its conclusions asserted the innocence of all those condemned in the Moscow trials. In its summary, the Commission wrote, "Independent of extrinsic evidence, the Commission finds that the conduct of the Moscow trials was such as to convince any unprejudiced person that no attempt was made to ascertain the truth, that while confessions are necessarily entitled to the most serious consideration, the confessions themselves contain such inherent improbabilities as to convince the Commission that they do not represent the truth, irrespective of any means used to obtain them, that Trotsky never instructed any of the accused or witnesses in the Moscow trials to enter into agreements with foreign powers against the Soviet Union, that Trotsky never recommended, plotted, or attempted the restoration of capitalism in the USSR. The Commission concluded, "We therefore find the Moscow trials to be frame-ups, implication of the rightists." In the second trial, Karl Radek provided the pretext for Great Purge to come on a massive scale with his testimony that there was a third organization separate from the cadres which had passed through school, as well as semi-Trotskyites, quarter Trotskyites, 1/8 Trotskyites, people who helped us, not knowing of the terrorist organization but sympathizing with us, people who from liberalism, from a front against the party, gave us this help. By the third organization, he meant the last remaining former opposition group called the Rightists, led by Bukharin, whom he implicated by saying, "I feel guilty of one thing more. Even after admitting my guilt and exposing the organization, I stubbornly refused to give evidence about Bukharin. I knew that Bukharin's situation was just as hopeless as my own, because our guilt, if not juridically, then in essence, was the same. But we are close friends, and intellectual friendship is stronger than other friendships. I knew that Bukharin was in the same state of upheaval as myself. That is why I did not want to deliver him bound hand and foot to the People's Commissariat of Home Affairs. Just as in relation to our other cadres, I wanted Bukharin himself to lay down his arms." Third Moscow trial. The third and final trial, in March 1938, known as the Trial of the 21, is the most famous of the Soviet show trials, because of persons involved and the scope of charges which tied together all loose threads from earlier trials. It included 21 defendants alleged to belong to the so-called bloc of rightists and Trotskyites, led by Nikolai Bukharin, the former chairman of the Communist International, former Premier Alexei Rykov, Christian Rakovsky, Nikolai Krestinsky, and Genrik Yagoda, recently disgraced head of the NKVD. The fact that Yagoda was one of the accused showed the speed at which the purgers were consuming its own, meant to be the culmination of previous trials. It was now alleged that Bukharin and others sought to assassinate Lenin and Stalin from 1918 murder Maxim Gorky by poison, partition the USSR and hand her territories to Germany, Japan, and Great Britain, and other preposterous charges. Even previously sympathetic observers who had stomached the earlier trials found it hard to swallow these new allegations as they became ever more absurd, and the purge expanded to include almost every living old Bolshevik leader except Stalin. No other crime of the Stalin years captivated Western intellectuals as the trial and execution of Bukharin, who was a Marxist theorist of international standing. For some prominent communists such as Bertram Wolfe, J. Lovestone, Arthur Koestler, and Heinrich Brandler, the Bukharin trial marked the final break with communism, and even turned the first three into fervent anti-communists eventually. To them, Bukharin's confession symbolized the depredations of communism, which not only destroyed its sons but also conscripted them in self-destruction and individual abnegation. The preparation for this trial, which took over a year, was delayed in its early stages due to the reluctance of some party members to denounce their comrades. It was at this time that Stalin personally intervened to speed up the process and replaced Yugoda with Nikolai Yezhov. Bukharin's confession on the first day of trial. Krestinsky caused a sensation when he repudiated his written confession and pleaded not guilty to all the charges. However, he changed his plea the next day after special measures, which dislocated his left shoulder among other things. Anastas Mikoyan and Vyacheslav Molotov later claimed that Bukharin was never tortured, but it is now known that his interrogators were given the order, beating permitted, and were under great pressure to extract confession out of the star defendant. Bukharin initially held out for 3 months, but threats to his young wife and infant son, combined with methods of physical influence, wore him down. But when he read his confession amended and corrected personally by Stalin, he withdrew his whole confession. The examination started all over again, with a double team of interrogators. Bukharin's confession in particular became subject of much debate among Western observers, inspiring Koestler's acclaimed novel Darkness at Noon and philosophical essay by Maurice Merleau-Ponty in Humanism and Terror. His confessions were somewhat different from others in that while he pleaded guilty to some total of crimes, he denied knowledge when it came to specific crimes. Some astute observers noted that he would allow only what was in written confession and refused to go any further. The result was a curious mix of fulsome confessions and subtle criticisms at the trial. After disproving several charges against him, one observer noted that Bukharin proceeded to demolish or rather showed he could very easily demolish the whole case. Quote, he continued by saying that the confession of the accused is not essential. The confession of the accused is a medieval principle of jurisprudence in a trial that was solely based on confessions. He finished his last plea with the words, "The monstrousness of my crime is immeasurable, especially in the new stage of struggle of the USSR. May this trial be the last severe lesson, and may the great might of the USSR become clear to all." Romain Rolland and others wrote to Stalin seeking clemency for Nikolai Bukharin, but all the leading defendants were executed except Rakovsky and 2 others. Despite the promise to spare his family, Bukharin's wife, Anna Larina, was sent to a labor camp, but she survived to see her husband rehabilitated. Purge of the Army. The Purge of the Red Army and Military Maritime Fleet removed 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 8 of 9 admirals, 50 of 57 Army Corps commanders, 154 out of 186 division commanders, 16 of 16 Army commissars, and 25 of 28 Army Corps commissars. At first it was thought 25 to 50% of Red Army officers had been purged. The true figure is now known to be in the area of 3 3.7 to 7.7%. This discrepancy was the result of a systematic underestimation of the true size of the Red Army officer corps, and it was overlooked that most of those purged were merely expelled from the party. 30% of officers purged in 1937 to 39 were allowed to return to service. The purge of the army was claimed to be supported by German forged documents. The claim is unsupported by facts, as by the time the documents were supposedly created, 2 people from the 8 in the Tukhachevsky group were already imprisoned, and by the time the document was said to reach Stalin, the purging process was already underway. However, the actual evidence introduced at trial was obtained from forced confessions.